All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today we're going way back to the 14th century to take a look at the life and thought of Nicholas of Autrecourt.
A fascinating, but maybe not super well-known figure, even among philosophers.
True, he wasn't exactly a household name even back in his day.
Right. He definitely ruffled some feathers, though. He liked to challenge the status quo, and he wasn't afraid to take on some of the biggest names in philosophy, even ended up on trial for his views.
Yikes, that's taking academic debate to a whole new level. But okay, before we get to all the drama, let's start with the basics. Who was Nicholas of Autrecourt, and what can you tell us about his life?
Well, like with a lot of figures from that time period, the biographical details are a little bit sketchy. We know he was born sometime between 1295 and 1298 in the Diocese of Verdun, France.
Okay, so we have a place and a rough date of birth. What about his education and, like, his career path?
It seems he was quite the scholar. We know he probably studied at the University of Paris, potentially even at other prestigious universities like Orléans, Avignon, or Montpellier. So he was definitely well educated.
Got it. So a real academic high flyer. What kind of positions did he hold?
He had a few different roles over the years. He served as prior at the Sorbonne for a time, and later he became a canon at Metz Cathedral. Pretty impressive, right?
Yeah, sounds like he was on track for a pretty successful career in the church.
You'd think so. But there's a twist. In 1347, he was actually put on trial for his philosophical views.
Wait, hold on. A trial for philosophy? Seriously?
Yeah.
What were the charges?
Well, officially, he was accused of false teachings, which was basically a catch-all term for ideas that the church considered heretical or dangerous.
So, like, having the wrong opinions could get you into some serious trouble back then, huh?
Yeah, things were a bit different in the 14th century. To give you an idea of how seriously they took this, some of his writings were actually burned.
Wow, they really went all out. So, what were these false teachings that got him into so much hot water? What was it about his philosophy that was so controversial?
Well, he was a real thorn in the side of the Aristotelian establishment. Aristotle's ideas were pretty much the gold standard in philosophy back then, and Nicholas had the audacity to challenge some of the most fundamental tenets of Aristotelian thought.
Okay, now you've got my attention. Give us the juicy details. What exactly was he challenging?
One of the big ones was the whole substance-accident distinction. This was a core concept in Aristotelian metaphysics, and Nicholas went right for it.
Substance accident, substance accident. Okay, remind me what that is again. It's been a while since my intro to philosophy class.
No problem. It's the idea that every physical object has two fundamental aspects. The substance, which is like the underlying essence of the thing, and the accidents, which are the particular properties or qualities that we perceive with our senses.
Right, right. So like if we take an apple as an example, the appleness itself would be the substance, and the color, the shape, the taste, those would be the accidents.
Exactly, you've got it. But Nicholas argued that we can only directly experience the accidents, the sensory qualities, not the substance itself. And if we can't experience it, how can we even know it exists?
Okay, I see where he's going with this. It's like, how do we know there's actually a chairness
Yeah,
behind the chair that we see and touch?
precisely. And he pushed this line of thinking even further when it came to the principle of causality, the idea that every event has a cause.
Oh boy, here we go. I can already feel my brain starting to hurt.
It gets pretty heady. So the standard Aristotelian view was that causes are real things that produce their effects, right? Like if I hit a billiard ball with a cue stick, the impact of the stick causes the ball to move.
Makes sense to me. That's how the world seems to work.
Sure, but Nicholas argued that we only ever observe events happening in sequence one after another. We never actually perceive the cause itself.
Huh. Okay, I think I see what he's getting at. Like we see the cue stick hit the ball, and we see the ball move, but we don't actually see the force that makes the ball move.
Exactly. So how can we be certain that the impact of the stick really caused the ball to move? Could there be some other unseen force at play that we're just not aware of?
Okay, now my head is officially spinning. If we can't be certain about causes, what can we be certain about? It sounds like he's pushing us towards some kind of radical skepticism.
Well, that's a good place to pause for now because Nicholas wasn't quite the complete skeptic that he might seem at first glance. And that's where things get really interesting. But we'll have to save that for the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, now you've got me hooked. I need to know how he reconciled those skeptical arguments with the rest of his philosophy. We'll be right back after a short break.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of Nicholas of Autrecourt. When we left off, we were wrestling with his skepticism, especially his doubts about substance and causes, and you were about to tell us how he managed to believe in our senses at the same time. Yeah, it's one of the things that makes him such a fascinating and complex thinker. It's tempting to just label him a skeptic and call it a day, but he was much more nuanced than that. He did believe in sense perception, but in his own unique way.
Okay, I'm all ears. How can you be skeptical about substances and causes, but still trust your senses?
Well, for Nicholas, the key was to distinguish between appearance and judgment. He said that our senses give us appearances, the raw data of experience, and those appearances are always reliable. The problem comes when we try to make judgments based on those appearances, when we go beyond what our senses are directly telling us.
I'm following so far. So, like if I see a red apple, my sense of sight is giving me a reliable appearance of redness and roundness, but my judgment that it's actually an apple might be wrong.
That's exactly it. The apple could be a wax replica, or it could be some kind of clever illusion. For Nicholas, the error isn't in the sense perception itself, but in our interpretation, our attempt to go beyond the immediate experience and connect it to a bigger concept like apple.
This is reminding me of all those optical illusions where you think you're seeing one thing, but it turns out to be something else entirely. It's like our senses are playing tricks on us.
Well, Nicholas wouldn't say that our senses are playing tricks on us. He would say that the senses are doing their job perfectly well, giving us accurate appearances. It's our minds that jump to conclusions, making judgments that go beyond what the senses are directly providing.
Okay, that makes more sense. So he's not saying we should distrust our senses altogether, just that we need to be careful about the judgments we make based on them.
Right. He was advocating for a kind of careful empiricism, a way of building knowledge from experience, but with a healthy dose of caution about our own interpretations.
I like that careful empiricism. It seems very balanced. He was skeptical, sure, but not in a way that just shuts down all possibility of knowledge.
Right. He was searching for a solid foundation for knowledge, something we can be certain of,
Right.
and he thought he found it in the immediacy of sensory experience.
So how do we make sure that our judgments are based on solid sensory evidence? Did he have any specific criteria for that?
Yeah, he did. He introduced this really interesting concept called appearances in the full light. He said that appearances are most reliable when they're clear, distinct, and free from distortion, like when you're looking at something in broad daylight with perfect visibility.
That makes sense. It's like saying, don't judge a book by its cover if you're reading it in a dimly lit room. You might miss some important details.
Exactly. For Nicholas, the lighting, the angle, the context, all these things can influence how we perceive things. So to form true judgments, we need to make sure we're basing them on the clearest, most reliable appearances possible.
This is really making me think about how often I jump to conclusions based on incomplete or fuzzy perceptions. It's a good reminder to slow down and really pay attention to what my senses are telling me.
I think that's a valuable insight that we can all take away from Nicholas's philosophy. He was pushing us to be more mindful, more aware of the limits of our own perception and judgment.
Okay, so we've talked about his skepticism and his theory of knowledge, and we've touched on his views on substance and cause. But earlier you mentioned that he had this radical idea that everything is eternal. I'm still trying to wrap my head around that one.
Yeah, that's where things get really mind-bending. To understand where he was coming from, we need to dive into his views on motion, matter, and change. And that's where his rejection of hylomorphism and his embrace of atomism come into play.
Oh, those are some big words. Hylomorphism, atomism. I'm going to need a little help unpacking those.
Sure, no problem. Hylomorphism was the dominant view of matter and change in the Aristotelian tradition. It's the idea that all physical objects are made up of two things, matter and form. The matter is like the raw material, the stuff the thing is made of, and the form gives it its specific shape, structure, and properties.
So, like, if we go back to that apple example, the matter would be the, I don't know, the apple stuff, whatever that is. And the form would be what makes it an apple, giving it its round shape, its red color, its sweet taste, all that.
Exactly. And change, according to this view, happens when matter takes on a new form or loses an existing form. So an acorn becomes an oak tree because it takes on a new form, right? That's hylomorphism in a nutshell.
Okay, I think I'm getting it.
Yeah.
But where does Nicholas fit into all of this?
Well, he wasn't a fan of hylomorphism at all. He argued that if we can't have certain knowledge of substances, and remember, he was very skeptical about substances, then we can't have certain knowledge of prime matter either. Prime matter being the formless, completely undetermined matter that Aristotle thought underlay all physical objects.
I see. So he's basically saying that if we can't be sure about the underlying essence of things, then this whole idea of prime matter is just a bunch of speculation.
Exactly. He thought it was a concept that went beyond our experience, something we couldn't directly perceive or prove, so he rejected it.
Bold move. So what did he propose instead? Did he have an alternative view of matter and change?
He did. He was drawn to atomism, which is this idea that all matter is composed of tiny, indivisible particles called atoms. These atoms are eternal and unchanging, and all change in the universe happens through the rearrangement of these atoms.
So instead of matter taking on different forms, it's just atoms combining and recombining in different ways, kind of like Legos, but on a much smaller scale.
That's a good analogy. And this is where his idea of eternity comes in. If atoms are eternal and everything in the universe is just a different arrangement of atoms, then everything is ultimately eternal. There's no real creation or destruction, just rearrangement.
Wow, that is a seriously different way of looking at the world.
Yeah.
No wonder he got into trouble with the church.
Yeah, it was a pretty radical departure from the accepted view, which was that God created the universe out of nothing.
Okay, so we've got atomism, we've got eternity. But there's one more piece of the puzzle that I'm curious about. If everything is made up of these tiny, indivisible atoms, what does that mean for space and time? Does he think they're made up of atoms too?
That's a great question, and it's one that Nicholas grappled with as well. He argued that if matter is composed of indivisible units, then it follows logically that space and time might also be structured in a similar way. So he proposed that space is made up of indivisible points, and time is made up of indivisible instants.
Wait, so he's saying that there are no smooth, continuous lines or curves, just a bunch of tiny dots, both in space and in time. My brain is officially fried.
It's definitely a challenging concept to wrap your head around. He believed that motion was just a series of jumps between these indivisible points in space and time, not a smooth, continuous flow.
Okay, this is all incredibly fascinating, but I have to admit, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed. We've gone from skepticism to sense perception, to atomism, to eternity, to indivisible points in space and time. It's like a philosophical roller coaster.
It is a wild ride, and we've only just scratched the surface of Nicholas of Autrecourt's thought. There's so much more to explore, and it's all connected in this really intricate and fascinating way.
Well, I'm definitely eager to hear more, and I'm sure our listeners are too. But I think we'll have to save the rest for the next part of our deep dive. Join us next time as we continue to delve into the mysteries of Nicholas of Autrecourt's philosophy. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the world of Nicholas of Autrecourt. We've covered a lot of ground, from his skepticism about substance and cause to his fascinating theory of knowledge based on appearances in the full light and even his radical atomism,
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, and I think we've all had our minds stretched a bit in the process.
to say the least. But there's one more thing I'm curious about before we wrap things up. We've talked about how controversial his ideas were, but I'm wondering if there were any thinkers back then who actually agreed with him or at least saw some merit in his arguments.
You know, that's a really good question. It's easy to focus on the negative reactions to his work, especially since he did end up on trial. But it's important to remember that he was part of a vibrant intellectual community in 14th century Paris.
Right, so he wasn't just some lone wolf shouting his ideas into the void.
Exactly. He was engaging in lively debates with other philosophers, some of whom were also pushing the boundaries of traditional Aristotelian thought. So it's likely that some of his contemporaries found his ideas intriguing, even if they didn't agree with everything he said.
It would be interesting to know who those sympathetic thinkers were and how they incorporated his ideas into their own work.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, tracking down those connections is a bit like detective work, piecing together fragments of evidence from different texts and historical records.
Sounds like a fascinating research project for someone.
Definitely. But even without knowing all the details, it's clear that Nicholas was part of a larger conversation, a kind of back and forth exchange of ideas that helped to shape the intellectual landscape of his time.
Like a medieval version of Twitter, but with more nuance and fewer trolls.
Uh-huh. Yeah, something like that. But in all seriousness, I think it's important to see him in this context as a participant in these lively debates, not just as a solitary figure who was condemned for his radical views.
Right. He was a catalyst for deeper thinking, even if some people found his ideas uncomfortable or even dangerous.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really interesting question about his legacy. How has his work been received by philosophers over the centuries? Has he been largely forgotten, or has he continued to influence later thinkers?
It's amazing to think that ideas from the 14th century could still be relevant today.
I know, right? But philosophy has this incredible power to transcend time and place. The questions that Nicholas was grappling with, questions about knowledge, reality, perception, they're still relevant to us today, even if the way we approach them has changed.
So where does Nicholas fit into all of this? Has he been relegated to the footnotes of history, or has he had a lasting impact?
Well, I'd say it's a bit of both. For a long time, he was definitely overshadowed by some of the bigger names in the history of philosophy. But in recent decades, there's been a renewed interest in his work, as scholars have recognized the originality and sophistication of his arguments.
So he's having a bit of a comeback. That's great to hear. What's driving this renewed interest?
Well, I think there are a few factors at play. One is that contemporary philosophers are increasingly interested in the history of philosophy and the ways in which ideas from the past can inform our current thinking. Another is that Nicholas's work resonates with certain contemporary philosophical trends like skepticism and naturalism.
Okay, that makes sense. So what are some of the key takeaways from Nicholas of Autrecourt's philosophy that might be relevant to philosophers and maybe even non-philosophers today?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is the importance of questioning our assumptions. Nicholas was constantly pushing his contemporaries to think critically about what they thought they knew, to examine the evidence for their beliefs, and to be open to the possibility that they might be wrong.
He sounds like the kind of professor who would keep his students on their toes. No easy answers allowed.
Definitely not. He would have challenged them to think for themselves and to justify their positions with solid arguments. And I think that's a valuable lesson for all of us, regardless of our philosophical background.
Another thing that struck me about his philosophy was his emphasis on sense experience. He might have been skeptical about abstract concepts like substance and cause, but he had a real appreciation for the power of our senses to give us knowledge of the world.
Yeah, he was a strong advocate for grounding our beliefs in what we can directly perceive, which connects his work to later developments in empiricism and even to the scientific method.
So even though he lived in the 14th century, his ideas have a surprising amount of resonance with modern thought.
It's a reminder that the big philosophical questions, the questions about knowledge, reality, and our place in the universe, these questions are timeless, and the answers that we come up with often have unexpected connections across time and intellectual traditions.
Well, I think it's safe to say that our deep dive into the world of Nicholas of Autrecourt has been a resounding success. We've explored his skepticism, his theory of knowledge, his metaphysics, and even a bit of his philosophy of language. And we've seen how his ideas continue to provoke and inspire us today.
It's been a real pleasure joining you on this intellectual adventure.
Likewise. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of Nicholas of Autrecourt. Until next time, keep those philosophical gears turning.